Hello, everybody. We had about 20 or so people register, so we're going to give it a few minutes and we'll get started here shortly. Okay, it's 6:03. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is the second public information meeting for the January 2023 cycle of Land Development Code amendments for the City of Tampa. My name is Stephen Benson with City Planning, and I'm going to ask my colleague to also introduce himself.
This is Eric Cotton. I serve as the city's zoning administrator and as the manager of the Development Coordination Office.
So this is the second of 3 public information meetings, virtual public information meetings. Last night, we had the meeting to discuss amendment to 2760 design exceptions. That meeting recording and the presentation has been posted on the website here on the screen if you'd like to go back and look at that. Today, we'll be discussing the 8 amendments listed on the screen. They will hopefully not take as much time to go through, and we are going to go ahead and transition over. Before we begin, please hold all questions until the end. And this transcript, as well as the question and answers, are going to be posted on our website and will be included in future staff reports to City Council. And this is the website that they're going to be posted at. So we're going to go ahead and start with the first set of amendments here on the screen. And Eric is going to get us going. And then Andy will be presenting the changes to the West Shore Overlay District. And then Eric will present this last one, electric vehicle charging. And then we'll take questions. So without further delay, I'm going to pass it over to Eric.
Thank you. Again, Eric Cotton, Development Coordination. And so the first one is cleanup. Actually, the first 2 are basically cleanup of the code and to try to so we can pivot quicker in the event of a natural disaster. So if you recall last year when Hurricane Ian was coming and it was predicted to hit Tampa, the mayor suspended city operations for non-essential personnel. Like most of us on this line, we're not TPD, fire, or public works where we had to report to get ready for the hurricane. That Thursday, there was a city council meeting. So they had to convene the hearing in order to continue the cases that were scheduled that night. This text amendment, the language we're working on, would be in the event of a state of emergency that's declared either by the governor related directly to Hillsborough County and Tampa, or by the mayor if it's a local state of emergency, would allow cases that are scheduled for a Thursday night, and it will probably work into also the Variance Review Board, ARC, and BLC to automatically be continued to the next available hearing, where either council or the Variance Review Board or whatever the agency is would either hear the case then, or they would formally continue that to another night. What happens now is if a meeting is canceled because of a hurricane or whatever, you have to renotice for those hearings, which then can delay you up for another 2 to 3 months because then you had to do your 30-day notice. This would avoid that process. So it would automatically get continued to another hearing. And if council wants to either have a special hearing at that next available hearing, they would then set that schedule for another meeting. So that's what that one is for. I think it's more of a cleanup to try to make it easier and more efficient in the event of a hurricane or whatever kind of natural disaster we may have coming through Tampa. Next slide, please, Stephen. Oh, that's the language. Okay. Well, we can skip this slide then. The next one is, and the next two slides after this, those are the language. Believe it or not, on our public notice signs and in the letter that goes out, we actually have language. We actually have a spot that shows the record or application number that's assigned by the Acela system when somebody applies for something. Unfortunately, it's not required by code, and occasionally we will have people that do not fill that in. So this is basically saying, clean up on our code that if where that spot is on those notice letters and on that sign, you have to put in the record number. We'll have people that leave it on there, and this is just basically saying you got to put it on the sign, you got to put it in the letter. Very minimal, just again, just some more code cleanup to make notice more transparent and concise. And again, the next two slides are basically just saying on the mail notice you have to put on the letter. And then on the other one is the next slide again is actually just adding the language for the sign itself. Next slide, please. This again is just cleanup, believe it or not. In Seminole Heights right now in the SHCG or the SHCI, you can actually build to 55 stories by code. It's the Scrivener's error. It's supposed to say 55 feet. 55 stories would be incredibly tall for Seminole Heights or anywhere else really in the city. You know, that's looking at over 500 feet. This is just bringing it into what the code actually is supposed to say. So that's just on the next slide, you'll see just the language with the strike through and underline. Very straightforward for the SHCI. It's feet, not stories. Next slide, please. This is one I think we've talked about over the years. This is basically saying if I'm a residential property in my rear yard, or my side yard, I'm like along, let's say, one of the commercial corridors along Florida, Kennedy, Nebraska, Del Mabry, and I abut a CG piece of property. Right now, by code, the tallest I can do a fence is 6 feet, whereas the commercial can do 8 feet by right. To do the 8 feet right now, you have to apply for a design exception. This would allow the residential property to actually do the 8 feet when they're directly abutting a commercial piece of property without having to get a design exception. The next slide actually has a language in there. But I think this is clearing it up. So again, if you're residential, you're adjacent to commercial, you can go to 8 feet in height without having to go through any additional process. Next slide, please. This is adaptive reuse. So right now in the code, adaptive reuse is allowed in the Ybor City zoning districts. It's allowed in the YC2, YC4, 7, 8, and 9. What this basically allows, if you have a piece of property that's in a historic district or, excuse me, in a historic district or on or a national or local landmark, enable you to actually change that use to neighborhood commercial or office or multifamily without having to go through a rezoning and having to bring the entire property up to code for tree and landscape regulations, parking, and such. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the proposed language. We've worked with Dennis Fernandez from Historic Preservation to get to come up with this language. Right now, we talk about the historical register, which is not really anything that's codified by us. But this is basically saying if it's in a local or national historic district or designated as a national or local landmark, you can go ahead and do the neighborhood serving uses or an office use or a residential use on a piece of property without having to go back and change the use. Excuse me, without having to change the zoning. You would go through a change of use process, but you wouldn't have to comply with parking and such. Next slide. Oh, well, this is information of where you can find the historic information. And this is just the changing of the code. So we would change 27-156, which is the general use table, allow it in the commercial in non-residential districts outside of the IG and IH. And the next slide is for Seminole Heights specifically, 27-211, and that would also have that same changes to the residential office CN, CG, and CI uses to allow for an adaptive reuse. Next slide, please. This is initiated by the Solid Waste Department. These are technical changes to the dimensional requirements for cart and container enclosures. On the next slide, it actually has, I believe, the language for both. They're asking for a little bit larger interior openings on the inside, and these are technical standards. It has to do with the size of the dumpsters and the maneuverability of the trucks when picking up carts and picking up the actual dumpsters and such. So those are simple changes to their regulations. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Well, this is up to Andy now. I'll mute myself.
Um, Good evening, everyone. I'll be presenting the West Shore overlay amendments. So this amendment is making several updates to the West Shore overlay, including expanding the street type categories, parking standards, bike treatments, and clarifying some buffer requirements. And a little bit of background, this was initiated by the West Shore Alliance, and I know it's been ongoing for, I think, a year or two, and we've been working with them to update this code. Next. All right, next. Just for some reference, this is the West Shore overlay. It's kind of a Swiss cheese of an overlay. In yellow is what you see is where it applies. There are islands that you see that don't apply. That's predominantly single family residential, which there are some pockets that actually of the yellow that actually encompass some single family. So some of these code changes are more or less exempting those single family homes from needing to meet the overlay requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the major issues here is that there's the West Shore Interchange project, and then there's going to be some new streets that are punched through. So these code amendments address those new street connections. We also looked at some common green space and tree waivers that we've seen, and we're modifying the code to eliminate the need for those waivers. And then there's also some minor changes to the dimensional requirements for the large and small open space requirements as required in the West Shore overlay, and also some parking reductions. Next slide. Okay, so these new streets are Rio, Laurel, and Trask, and this is all part of the West Shore Interchange project, and FDOT has already adopted these standards when they rebuild the street network. So it's going to be a 6-foot sidewalk on the local commercial streets and an 8 to 10-foot sidewalk in the priority pedestrian street, which is going to be Occident between Gray and Cypress. And then also we're codifying the Gray Street Bike Boulevard as a connection from the West Shore all the way to downtown, which would link the Courtney Campbell and future Howard Franklin projects to downtown. It's not necessarily going to be a formal cycle track, but it's going to be a low stress connection. Next slide. And these are the actual proposed changes to the code, the red being the new additions to the street network. So these street networks are ready, and the street networks and standards are already in the code. So these are just adding the new ones, like you said, Occident, Laurel, Rio, and Trask. And next slide. And these are the currently adopted standards in the West Shore overlay. So if you're building, a new project on one of these streets and you're on a either priority pedestrian street on the left or local commercial street on the right, you have to build to these standards. So this is just again taking the new streets and applying the existing standards to these new streets. Next slide. Some other changes here. It's if you look at the diagram on the right, on West Shore, you have actually a tree requirement. You have two different types of trees. You have a streetscape, which is closest to the curb, and then you have a buffer tree, which is located on private property. Right now, it says that the buffer trees are required regardless of the planting width. This is just requiring that if you have a minimum of a 6 foot planting strip, then you need the tree. If you're less than 6 feet, you don't. There's not the tree requirement goes away. And because what we've seen is that if you have a 3 or 4 foot planting strip, it's not enough space for a tree to actually survive. So in essence, we're just killing trees and also creating conflict with the required street trees. So the buffer trees are still required if there is an ample planting strip and there's physically room to accommodate both rows of trees. Another thing is that up to 50% of the palm trees can be relocated on site and retained for credits. Right now, there's no credit for the developer if they relocate the palm trees. So this would create an incentive to actually relocate the large palm trees on a lot of these sites, and also create opportunity if you have palm trees along the street and you can retain them elsewhere on site, then that creates new opportunity for shade trees above the public right of way, which is where they're most beneficial. Next slide. Okay, another here is let's see. Right now, there's the open space requirement if you're building 6-story and above. If you're building a multifamily project 6 stories and above, you are required to do open space. If you're 4 stories, there's no requirement. This is actually instituting that open space requirement for structures 4 stories and above. So it's in response to get more open space on some of these more of these mid-sized projects. I wouldn't call them mid-rise, but more of the the 3 to 4 story podium projects. There would be an open space requirement. All right, next slide. This section here is amending the current open space requirements in the West Shore. In the commercial overlay, on certain street intersections, there's a requirement for public open space, which are, I think, smaller, 20 by 20, and then larger, 40 by 40. So what this is saying is that it gives you flexibility. So instead of doing a 40 by 40 space, as long as 1,600 feet, you could adjust the width. So basically, we're making it legal to build a rectangular open space as opposed to a square open space, which is currently required by code. And then also, if you want to go shorter on the width, still again, as long as you meet the overall square footage. If you want to go narrower on the width, you also have to provide 2 amenities such as benches, shade structures, trash receptacles, bike repair station, water fountain, or some other similar pedestrian amenity. All right, next slide. This is probably the biggest one, and is the proposed parking changes. We're looking to reduce the parking requirements in West Shore, given that it's rapidly evolving into a dense mixed-use environment, probably more similar to downtown than any other district. And we're looking to just reduce the requirements for parking because we know that the current code requires too much parking. So a lot of these projects are built, and then there's, anecdotally, we've heard and see there are often, several decks of empty parking lots or empty parking garages. So this is bringing it more in line with just letting the market dictate a little bit more. We think even with these proposed reductions that developers will still probably build more parking than is required than what will be proposed. All right, next. This one is eliminating some of the overlay requirements, exempting single family homes from some of the requirements. So the big one here is that right now, the way the code is written, that you have to have 50% of your ground floor built out of a transparent material. That's to activate the street front. We've run into problems like this project on the top here. You could see it's actually within that some of the pockets, actually the overlay standards apply to the single family or small scale residential. And that's exempting projects like this from meeting that 50% transparency requirement, because it's just not, you just don't build residential projects like that, some small residential projects like that. It's not possible. Okay, next slide. And here's just kind of a rundown of, if you could hit next, and you'll see the purple is what current code requires, and then the black is kind of what is being proposed. So there's a general reduction in parking. Most of these are very minor, and even just if you actually do the math, it probably comes out to about the same, because there's current code has a, maybe use a per, 0.25 per person, whereas the current code is, 3 per thousand. But if you actually break it down, a lot of these are just, they come out to the same. Next slide. The big change is, the major takeaway is that roughly we could say that residential parking is being reduced to 1 space per unit. And you could see in the italics there on the right, the current, as I call it, old code, those are the requirements. You have 1 space per studio, 1.5 spaces for 1 to 2 bedrooms, and 2 spaces for 3 bedrooms. This is essentially just, this is requiring 1 space per unit. And what we see in downtown, even with the parking requirements that have been reduced, we're still seeing projects that are being over parked according to code. So this again is just allowing the market to kind of dictate parking more so than now. All right, next slide. All right, that is it for the West Shore updates.
I think we have some representatives from the Alliance here who might want to say a few words about the process briefly. So Michael and Kevin, and I think Randy, you all should be able to unmute yourselves if you'd like to speak now.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, my name is Michael Marino. I'm the Executive Director of the West Shore Alliance. Thank you for the presentation, Andy. Just wanted to mention that we have been working on this with Randy Cohen and our Master Plan Committee going back to 2019. So a lot of what you've seen here has been a product of our Master Plan Committee, as well as going through our board of directors and executive committee representing the 400 businesses that are members of ours. In addition, some of the amendments as proposed reflect some of what we've heard, not just from the development community, but also from the neighborhood in terms of scale of buildings, as well as parking and other factors. So really, this is meant to allow for developments rather than requesting variances to go through the process more smoothly. Also reflects the urbanization of the district, while also considering some of the comments that we have heard from time to time from the residents. But thank you to the city staff for working with us on this, and we'll wait for any questions. Thank you.
And before we start taking questions, I think we have one more amendment to go through.
Good evening, everybody. Eric's back again for the last item on the agenda before we go into the questions. This is originally initiated by City Council. So there's a request to amend Chapter 27 to require developments that are new that are going to have over 50 parking spaces to require 5% of those parking spaces to be EV capable. So what that means is the infrastructure would be put in place where charging stations eventually would end up being, but not have to actually install the actual charger. So when construction is being taken and before the parking lot is all paved over and all, there would be electrical would be run out and then capped off at a certain location, where in the future, when the market is ready for it or the development feels it's ready, they would be able to install the EV chargers. So this is just requiring them to actually have the infrastructure put in place, but not the actual chargers. And I think there's language. I don't know if we have language yet to that we've drafted up for that, but we will have it by the time it goes to City Council back again in April.
Okay, so I know Steve has his hand up, so we'll go to you first, Steve. But before we do, just if you have a question, please go ahead and indicate that in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak. And then we'll go in order that the comments are submitted. Just a reminder that the transcript of the meeting and the Q&A will be posted for future staff reports. So if you'd like to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand. The first person I'm going to unmute here is Steve. And Steve, you should be able to unmute yourself. See if you can do so.
Think you may have to dial him in, Stephen. I don't think his unmute button is working today.
Okay, while we're working on Steve, we'll go ahead and go to number 2. So Gary, go ahead and you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. My question was on the fence height change from 6 to 8 feet up against commercial property, which is a great idea. Does that apply to the entire lot, the residential lot, or is it just the side that is abutting the commercial?
This is Eric. Just the portion abutting the commercial, not the entire lot.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure if it read that easily that way. Maybe it does. I didn't study it.
So the language is still in a very draft form. We still have to massage it and meet with legal and all of that, everything anyway. So if there's a confusion, we'll make sure it's clarified before it gets to council.
Okay, thank you.
And next up, we have Tim McGaffey. I've gone ahead and given you the ability to unmute your mic so you can ask your question.
Hey, I put a couple in the chat as well, but I think the ones that were not simple to put in the chat were actually all related to the West Shore overlay. There was a couple references to the room on the planting strip. And I think my concern or questions around that is whether this either allows or encourages smaller setbacks. Because the question would be in a lot of these cases, why wouldn't you have enough room in the planting strip if the setbacks were meeting the overlay requirements? That's the first question. I got a bunch more, but we'll start with that one.
Specifically on West Shore Boulevard?
No, the overlay, the entire overlay.
Well, those setbacks have existed as part of the original overlay.
You joined late, Michael, so you might have missed it. There was a whole discussion about the what was referred to as the planting strip, and the diagrams that are on the slides that are coming up now. And so let's see, I don't remember. This is not the one. There was a different diagram that was about, yes. And several reference. Go ahead if you know the answer.
Yeah, this is Andy, and I'll let Michael also speak to this if I don't cover it. But I know from reviewing these projects, we have that buffer tree there. So the one on the left, it's problematic when we have your setbacks force you up close to the right-of-way line, and then you have a street tree requirement, or the buffer tree requirements, which shrinks that buffer strip down to sometimes less than 6 feet. It's not enough room for the tree to actually live.
But my question would be, why would the setbacks not be big enough in the first place, right? Because, I mean, really what you're talking about is new development here. So, you know, why wouldn't they be on the right setback in the first place?
This is Randy Cohen. If I could jump in for a moment.
Hey, Randy, go for it.
Hey, our building setbacks in West Shore are a minimum of 10 feet. What we found in the past, there are situations where while the building setback is 10 feet, that doesn't necessarily mean you end up with a 10-foot grassed or open area. You have sidewalks, courtyards, etc., other requirements by the city. So what this basically says is if you have 6 feet, you're going to plant a tree, where right now some folks are not planting trees and having a little more than 6 foot there. We're trying to clarify that you don't need 10 feet for a tree, but you need 6 feet. Therefore, we're setting a standard where there is none today. And we've had situations where a tree could have probably gone in, but it was less than 10 feet. The city standard is 10 feet for a tree. So we're actually trying to encourage buffer trees by defining them rather than letting them sit with the normal city code.
Okay, so I see. Maybe it was just the way it was worded when I initially heard it. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I can see how you can look at it on the other side. What we're trying to do is make sure we get more trees rather than less trees.
Right. That's ultimately the essence of my concern. But then I guess that ties into my next question, which is, why are we wasting our time with palm trees?
We're not wasting our time with palm trees. What we have right now is a code that if a palm tree is moved, it is considered taken, whether it's transplanted or not. In West Shore, we've got an awful lot of large, expensive palms as opposed to an open area of town where you have a lot of cabbage palms. So we're simply trying to provide a property owner with the ability to transplant palms to the extent it feels right on that property and receive some credit for, rather than receiving no credit, therefore the palm trees all go away.
I mean, is it specifying the varieties of acceptable palms that you can get credit for? Because
No, we did not do that. We would have a long laundry list of them. Frankly, there are not that many palms, and there are only 50% of them that can be retained, so it's a relatively small number. I tested it out on a few of the projects I've been involved in the last few years. So it's not a huge number, but it simply allows for some specimen palms to be kept and given credit for. I don't think anyone's going to be transplanting a cabbage palm for the heck of it. Frankly, the cabbage palm, unfortunately, is not worth as much as it costs to transplant it. So we're trying to save some quality palms where we can.
and then I hear you. I don't know how I feel about it exactly because
Sure.
I hear you, but obviously they're not really a shade tree, so it's not as valuable, right? I mean, that obviously the purpose was shade, in the overlay. So.
Well, you can still plant palms under the existing code. We're just thinking we can get larger palms by transplanting than new palms, which aren't that big to start with. So,
I mean, I guess maybe I would say I would rather see the code specify that they should be shade trees rather than palm trees because honestly that would be way more valuable for everybody. Or at least minimize the number of palm trees that could be allowed.
Well, 50% of palms would mean if you've got 12 palms on your site and 20 other trees, you're only going to be able to move 6 palm trees. So it is minimizing it quite a bit. It's not 50% of the trees on site, it's 50% of the existing palm trees on site.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah, and to interrupt you, the buffer tree and street tree and the current code and West Shore, they are required to be shade trees. So there's bosque elms, live oak, winged elm, bald cypress. Those are the requirements.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
thought
they
were. That's why it was a little confusing that this palm thing was coming up because I thought they were.
This is really interior, the parking lots, et cetera, things of that nature.
Okay.
Is where this pops up at. And Andy, that was a perfect clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
And then go ahead.
Well, I mean, and then the last question I had about the overlay was the one space per unit. I understand the reason. I understand the reason that you're seeking this. The problem I have with it is exactly what was mentioned at the top, which is that the overlay is Swiss cheese with a bunch of residential areas as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen time and again that the spaces required for things like townhomes and stuff like that end up being inadequate, and neighbors complain.
There's a provision in the overlay that's being proposed along with this parking code amendment, Tim, that it is not available to any properties that are adjacent to single family residential.
Okay, so I think, I mean, me personally, I would like to see that, right? I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, it's in the proposed code.
Okay, because that, I get where what you're proposing makes sense in high density, right? But obviously the parts other than high density, I think this is very problematic, just based on history of what's come before council in the past.
Yeah, no, the Alliance, we're always looking to protect the single family neighborhoods that exist within the overlay. And so we've got many standards that are either apply to you when you are adjacent to single family, or in this case, deny you the ability to do those particular parking reductions if you're adjacent to single family residential. So yeah, we don't want to create a parking problem for the single family whatsoever. We see some of them out there right now in the neighborhood, and we're trying to address them in this fashion.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, I'll let, I know other people have some questions, and I put a couple others in the chat related to some of the other code areas. So I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the draft code language, and it's in here about the.
You need to zoom in, Andy.
Okay.
To zoom in a little bit. Thank you.
Perfect.
And I think this gets to the concern about the single family residential here. If you could see the highlighted. So the required parking for mixed use development is not located adjacent to single family. So it's in there. We need to, we're internally circulating this for review and comments, because I think we need to clarify this a little better, but it's in there.
I mean, I see what you're trying to do there. Now, there was a table, right, that was presented in the presentation, but I don't know if there's a table in the actual code. And so I guess that's where maybe this gets a little confusing, right? As it talks about a reduction in 10% in the language there.
Yeah, it is in the code. It's not in this one here, but I did put that table in there. And again, we're circulating it internally, because we're going to have some feedback from our mobility department about how we reconcile the parking.
Yeah, because that's kind of the question, right? Is how is it? It's got to be presented in a way that's clear, right? That's easy to understand. That, okay, it's either a 10% difference from the table as printed, or or the table as printed includes a 10%. In other words, however it's done just has to be clear, not have any ambiguity to it. I know Steve had some questions in the chat too.
So I think, I'm not sure, Steve, if you can unmute yourself, but I can read your question. So the first question is, do the West Shore overlay changes address the existing special street setbacks? I believe the answer is no to that. And the next question is, how are plantings handled under overhead wires?
This is Andy. I could answer that one. We run to that a lot, actually. We have the shade tree requirement, but a lot of streets have the overhead wire. So what we do is at least when I was reviewing these, I would get with natural resources and find an acceptable street tree species, typically crepe myrtles. That's typically the go-to for underneath power lines. So it's not ideal. I mean, I'd love to bury all the wires citywide and get proper shade trees, but right now we just defer to natural resources for an alternative species.
Yeah, this is Randy. I'll jump in just for a second. We do have a typology of street trees from the standpoint of height. width, et cetera. And there are a number of those that address power line issues. They're the typical trees the city recommends in those circumstances.
Okay, this next question might be another one for Randy. I'm not sure. And this is from Steve. Can maneuvering in the right-of-way be extended to other areas for parking? How is parking to be handled along Kennedy, which does not conform to the code now?
Our overlay only applies to new development and redevelopment, so therefore it does not address any existing conditions such as those on Kennedy Boulevard. I'm very aware of it. The maneuvering in the right-of-way is typically used for loading berths and solid waste operations. We're requesting those while they are on low-volume streets that do not have residential. So it's literally local streets in West Shore that are commercial in basis rather than residential. Those would be the only areas where you would not require a waiver for maneuvering in the right-of-way. On any major roadway or any residential street, you would still require to go through review, either design exception or rezoning, and deal specifically with your maneuvering in the right-of-way issues.
And then I think this is just a comment, but it would be important to address special street setbacks as they conflict with some of the proposal. Any,
And this is, I was
go
gonna
ahead.
say, this is just, in regard to Steve's comment, that is something that, Steve and I, Mobility, have been looking at that section of the code and what streets are still necessary to have, where we can expect the need for right of way and such, and we have to leave it legal. So that's a long-term project that we are looking at, the special street setback requirements of the code.
Yeah, when the mobility department is looking to finalize their citywide mobility plan and also update the comp plan, the transportation section, there will be new preservation corridors identified. So once that is done, which I think they're very close to doing, then we'll be able to true up the special street setbacks, because that's the intent behind the special street setbacks. It's for future transportation improvements. And were there any more questions or comments?
Tim had other questions that were put in the chat, I think, regarding, but I'm not sure what section he was asking about it anymore.
I see. Yeah, Tim, you had a question about number 4 and number 6. You should be able to unmute now, Tim.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so number 4 was the one about the fence height. And so Eric, you mentioned CG when you were discussing it. Is it CG only?
No, it's any non-residential zoning district. I just use CG because that's what I use as my example.
Okay, because even in the text, it was shown only briefly, so I'm not sure I read it all, but it looked like it had specific uses, right? So it didn't look like it said, a mixed use or a PD or whatever, right? It kind of had mentioned commercial use, and so I was just trying to, I don't know, I guess again, clear that up, right, and make sure it was understood.
Yeah, it's for any non-residential. It would be because there are residential uses adjacent to industrial uses.
Yep.
So as long as the use next door is non-residential, you could go to the 8 feet. And Mr. Brown is correct. We need to clarify and clean up that language a little bit to make sure it's not the whole property. just the portion that's adjacent to the non-residential use.
Okay. But even at that, right? I mean, and again, I'm just thinking about this in the sense that when you say non-residential, right, there's a pretty big difference. Some cases we've got relatively high density next to single family, even if the high density is multifamily. And so clearly that's a residential use.
Mhm.
But I mean, there's a big difference if you've got, stories of people hanging out, especially remember now that, in a lot of areas of the city, you have to build your base elevation up anyway. So, in a lot of cases, if you're next to an existing residential property, single family residential property, those extra feet seem like they're valuable regardless of whether we're talking, a residential use or a non-residential use on the commercial side. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I don't know if the city's ready to allow 8-foot fences everywhere in the city either. So, I mean, we're looking at it more because this has been an ongoing issue since the time I've been with the city. Has always been commercial adjacent to or non-residential adjacent to residential, and that conflict because what used to require a variance. And I'm sure Gary remembers when he was on the VRB processing and hearing those cases where if the non-residential use had come in and asked for the fence, they could have done it by right up to the 8 feet. But I understand what you're saying with the change in the elevations where, existing houses here and the new houses up here because they're starting here.
Right.
Not that dramatic, but I know what you mean.
Well,
Randy here, if I can jump in for a second, only because it's a personal issue for me. I have a house being built behind me. Their finished floor is actually 6 feet above existing grade. So their finished floor is right at the top of my fence. It's
the house next to me that's being built, the bottom of the window is above my fence.
Yeah, well, mine, the patio floor in the back is level with my fence. So Eric, I think it's going to be an unfortunate issue that you're going to hear more and more about in the future.
Understand.
And so that's why I'm saying even for other commercial uses, right? Multifamily, things like that, it seems like this would be something that would come up, right? Not just like a retail or an industrial or whatever. And then I'd also had the question about the 23-6, which was the historic district one. You mentioned that you'd still have to go through an existing process for a change of use. Could you just explain that? Because I guess I don't know what that process is. Because you're not talking about a rezoning.
Correct.
So what process are you referring to?
So there's two uses. There's two things that the building department will run somebody through. One's a change of use, one's a change of occupancy. What the adaptive reuse does normally will not require a change of use if you're doing adaptive reuse, because you don't have to comply with parking and tree and landscape code and such like that. There might be an issue where a change of use would be required. For the interior side of everything, a change of occupancy would be required. And that would address, and the change of use may get, both of those uses most of those may get triggered in the event of when you're going from a residential use to, let's say, an office use, and now you're doing a place of assembly. So that you're doing interior remodeling and you have to have a fire exit that you didn't have to have with the single family home, for instance. That's, I don't know if that's the best example, but that's what I was referring to. It's a process that's part of the building permit. When you pull a permit to do the work on the property itself, the remodeling and such, that triggers both the change of use and the change of occupancy review. In most cases, this won't trigger change of use. I misspoke when I said that earlier.
Yeah, and Eric, a good example is if you go to a commercial building, you're going to end up having an ADA bathroom required. Certain interior changes must be made to accommodate the public if you're going to a commercial building.
And just to clarify, this is only for structures that are in a historic district or a structure that's designated as a landmark. So there are maps. There's a list of landmarks in the city, which are more limited, and then there are maps for the local historic districts that can be viewed, and you can see which structures are contributing, which ones are not contributing on those maps.
Yeah, no, which I understood, but I mean, I'm thinking of, like most of these, right? I mean, the Seminole Heights National Historic District is a small strip, right, which is entirely residential. Hampton Terrace is a small strip that's basically all the contributing structures are residential, right? And so that's why I'm thinking, I'm noodling on this one, right? Because I'm trying to figure out, okay, these are very clearly, those at least are very clearly residential neighborhoods, right? With no other real purpose except on the periphery. And those aren't contributing structures. So that's why I'm trying to understand exactly how this comes to play.
So I think this might help with that a little bit. It's permitted only in these zoning districts. So if these zoning district, if that structure is not in the zoning district, then this wouldn't be affected. It would be affected by this. So you can see all the residential districts are not there. Go ahead. Sorry, Eric.
No, then the next slide actually highlights the Seminole Heights district itself, where it's just in the SH, again, the non-residential Seminole Heights districts.
Okay. All right.
We're not saying you can take a single family home and put an office there in the middle of a residential neighborhood. That's not the intent of the adaptive reuse.
The use has to be permitted.
Okay, I see. All right. This wasn't shown previously. Now this makes a lot more sense. Okay. Okay. That answers my question. Thank you.
Are there any more questions or comments? Okay, we'll go ahead and just skip to the end here. So each amendment can be viewed here on this website. We're going to go ahead and post this presentation to the website as well if you want to take a look at it, and the recording from tonight. If you have further comments you'd like to provide, we ask that you please email them to tampaplanning@tampagov.net. And if you wouldn't mind including the amendment number, we can be sure to include this in our packet when this is presented back to City Council in April. And with that, thanks everybody for calling in, and have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.